And welcome to our public lecture for today. It is my pleasure to introduce our lecturer, Deanna Womack. Dr. Deanna Womack is Assistant Professor of History of Religions and Multifaith Relations at Emory University's Candler School of Theology in Atlanta, Georgia. And she is as well the Director of the school's Leadership and Multifaith Program. Her teaching and scholarship combine interests in the history of Christian-Muslim and American-Arab relations. Her first book, Protestant, Gender and the Arab Renaissance in Late Ottoman Syria, published by Edinburgh University Press, will appear in March 2019, and I have a little brochure flyer about it, so you can acquire it, hopefully. Her book explores encounters between American missionaries and Arab residents of Ottoman Syria in the pre-World War I period. In particular, it explores the contributions of the American mission press in Beirut and uncovers the history of Syrian women writers and preachers who navigated cultural and religious boundaries in their experiences with missionaries. Womack is currently writing a book for American pastors on Christian-Muslim relations and is conducting a historical research project funded by the Gerda Henkel Foundation in Düsseldorf, Germany, on conceptions of gender in American and British discourses about Islam. Womack is an ordained pastor in the Presbyterian Church USA and earned her MDiv, THM and PhD at Princeton Theological Seminary in New Jersey. Her PhD thesis, completed in 2015, centered on the history of Protestantism in Syria and Lebanon in the 19th and early 20th century. We also would like to note that from 2008 to 2010, she and her husband Mike lived in Lebanon as mission volunteers, teaching at evangelical schools in Zahle and in Louazy. She also taught a course here at Nest in the year 2009. Today, she returns among us to present her lecture entitled For God and al-Watan, Lebanese Women, Authors, Activists and Preachers in the 19th-Century Nahda. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Womack as our lecturer.
Thank you so much, Rima, for the introduction, and Dr. Sabra, thank you for the invitation. It's wonderful to be back here in Beirut and back at the Near East School of Theology, and I'm so glad to share this time with all of you. So thank you for being here with us. So I'll jump right in, and you'll notice I changed my title slightly. I'm focusing just on Lebanese Protestant women because to talk about all Lebanese women would take us hours and hours, and we don't have quite that much time. So the era now known as the Nahda has been characterized variously as an Arab awakening, or the liberal age of Arabic thought, or an Arabic print revolution. Now this last designation relates to one facet of the Renaissance in the Ottoman Arab provinces, which included both a cultural movement that unfolded throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, and a political movement that arose toward the end of the 19th century. In this lecture, I'm going to focus on the cultural facets of the Nahda, centered in Beirut, and the role of Syrian and Lebanese Protestants, and particularly women, in advancing the educational, linguistic, literary, and journalistic goals of this modern Renaissance. Now, for Protestants in Ottoman Syria up until World War I, Beirut was a hub for the Nahda. And thus, this city's transformation into a bustling port city at that time provides the backdrop for our discussion. By the 1870s, Beirut had emerged as a new cultural and literary center, which gave rise to dozens of missionary, ecclesiastical, and private printing presses, to the increased production and consumption of Arabic books and periodicals, and to the foundation of scholarly societies, literary salons, and modern schools. Changing conceptions of what it meant to be modern, as well as new local understandings of political and sectarian identity, also spread outward from the city into rural areas through literary networks and through the communication systems of various religious communities. And the Syrian and Lebanese Protestants of the period played an important role in disseminating some of these new ideas across the region, sometimes in partnership with American missionaries. Now, I have found that most studies of the Arab Renaissance focus on its sociocultural or political achievements. But my research on the Protestant community, and in fact the various religious communities here in Lebanon, has led me to believe that the religious identity and spiritual convictions of the Nahda pioneers must also be taken seriously. Through their published works, the early generations of Syrian and Lebanese Protestants, for example, showed that the Nahda was indeed both cultural and religious at once. This can be seen in the life of Boutros al-Bustani, arguably the most well-known of many evangelical church members who contributed to the Arab Renaissance. The religiosity of Nahdawi Protestant pioneers can also be seen in the books, articles, and public addresses that lesser-known Ottoman Syrian men and women published at the American Mission Press, or AMP, as I'm going to call it, back when it was housed near the Evangelical Church of Beirut. American missionaries established the press to spread their interpretation of Christianity, but as the 19th century advanced, it quickly became a site of American-Syrian collaboration. By the 1800s, Nahdawi Protestants like the Beirut Church deacon and AMP editor Ibrahim al-Hurani contributed to the cultural currents of the Nahda through Arabic poetry, scientific studies, and commentaries on Ottoman society that were published at the Mission Press. The example of Hurani and other men who blended evangelical commitments with modern scholarship and literary endeavors helps us to expand our conceptions of the Nahda, as it's usually framed as a secular movement. Likewise, expanding the traditional views of the 19th century Arab Renaissance is my foregrounding of Syrian and Lebanese women's voices. For to borrow a phrase from the Indian scholar Chandra Mohanty, under Western eyes, too often Middle Eastern women have been rendered a homogeneous and silent group. Missionary men spoke about them and missionary women spoke for them, endeavoring to save their Syrian and Lebanese sisters while advancing their own positions in a religious enterprise controlled by men. Yet Syrian and Lebanese women spoke too, and often, and they found in the American Mission Press an avenue for influencing the wider society and a wider audience through printed Arabic. Women first signed their names to articles for the Mission Press, the periodical that it published called An-Nashra al-Usbu'iyya, the weekly bulletin, in the 1880s. And this is the beginning of the magazine or journal that's still around today. And they began publishing books and novels at the American Mission Press in the 1890s. Now, these largely neglected texts put Nahdawi women at the forefront of the Arab women's movement that gained momentum around the early 20th century. So the efforts that these women undertook for God and for the homeland, or al-Watan, as they often called it, shall be my focus for the remainder of our time here, as we look at both known and unknown female authors, activists, and even preachers in what would later become contemporary Lebanon. I'll introduce you to two genres of writing on women's education and child-rearing. Let's see if I have that slide. That made Ottoman Syrian Protestant women the forerunners of what became known as the Arab Women's Awakening in the early 20th century. And then we will discuss a third literary genre, that of women's sermonic texts that set evangelical women's publications apart from some of the writings of their Orthodox, Catholic, Muslim, and Jewish counterparts in the women's movement. But first, it's important to consider a bit of background on the women's Nahda to understand how significant the contributions of Nahdawi Protestant women really were. And at this point, I just want to note that when I refer to the term Syrians, I'm speaking of citizens of Ottoman Syria, so the larger region, people who lived in Ottoman Syria before 1914 in what would soon become modern Lebanon and Syria. So So I'm using Syria as a broad and inclusive term as it was used at that time and not as attached to the modern nation state. Although I have to say nearly all of the women I'll be talking about today would probably define themselves as Lebanese if they lived here now because of their geographical origins. So in the 19th century Ottoman Empire, modernizing reforms and the rise of the independent press establishments afforded women new opportunities to showcase their literary talents while engaging in conversations on the role of women in the home and modern society. Such discussions took place in press publications, literary salons, women's societies, and in homes in Syria and throughout the empire. Qasim Amin's Tahrir al-Mar'a, or the liberation of women, is often, but wrongly, considered the launching point for the women's movement in the Ottoman Arab provinces. For other intellectuals in the region took up the subject of women's rights much earlier. For example, these included the Muslim writer Rif'a Tahtawi, who died in 1873 in Egypt, and the aforementioned Budrus al-Bustani, with his discourse on the education of women that he addressed to the Syrian Society of Arts and Sciences in 1849. Now, the commitment of al-Bustani and other Christian men, as well as Muslim men, to the promotion of knowledge and national progress led them to emphasize the importance of women's education and women's roles in the development of a modern homeland. To their ranks, we might add Protestant women, like one named Farida Atiya, a resident of Beirut and Tripoli whose novel on the benefits of women's education I'm going to examine a bit later in this talk. This book went to press in 1893, 6 years before Qasim Amin's acclaimed work. So while much has been written on the debates about women among men, as Ellen Fleischman has noted, women, such as Farida, themselves, far from being merely the objects of debate, energetically engaged in these contestations, and they challenged conservative male polemicists as well as other women. So it was the opportunity for formal education, often in Protestant schools for girls, that enabled the women of Syria to join in this Nahdawi production. Among the Protestant-educated Syrian women who became writers, the most well-known included the Jewish journalist Esther Moyal, the Maronite writer Labiba Hashim, and the Greek Orthodox press pioneer Alexandra Avierno, as well as the Protestant periodical founder Rosa Antun Haddad. Other women, some of whom you see here, studied at home, or they attended Catholic or Maronite missionary schools, or a bit later they enrolled in new Muslim schools for girls, like the Maqasid schools here in Beirut. Now, regardless of where these women studied, two factors defined the generation of Syrian women who began their literary careers around the turn of the century, right before the early 20th, I would say. First, they came from a diversity of religious backgrounds, and second, these writers in the early 20th century built on the legacy of Protestant women who had been publishing in the Arabic presses of Beirut since at least the 1880s. These Protestant women paved the way for the vibrant Arab women's press movement in Syria and also in Egypt that gained momentum in the 1890s. As Nahdawi women began founding their own periodicals and publishing novels and journal articles in higher numbers. So I'd like to turn to this neglected history now, showing how a community of evangelical women joined in the Nahda to serve God and to serve the homeland. So to the ranks of early Protestant women writers whom you may have heard of, like Warda al-Yaziji or Adelaide al-Bustani, who've received some attention in scholarship, I'll add a number of others who made use specifically of the American Mission Press and the mission periodical An-Nashra, which was primarily written and edited by Syrians by the 1880s. So who were some of these women, and how did they advance the Nahda? The writers whose work I explore attained the highest level of education possible for women of their time by graduating from American mission high schools in Beirut, Tripoli, and Sidon, or from British institutions in Beirut and Shimlan. Their graduation certificates entitle them to teach in Protestant schools, which almost all of them did. Now, although women had been studying in and teaching in Protestant schools for decades, It was those who wrote for the American Mission Press in the 1880s and 90s who were among the second generation of Protestants to graduate from these schools. And they were coming of age at a time of increasing intellectual and literary opportunities for women. Many of these women became involved in the production of the journal or the magazine An-Nashra by contributing short pieces like obituaries, wedding announcements, and notices on local events at local churches and schools. And here you can see some examples. I know there's a lot of typing there, but I thought I'd add them because perhaps some of the family names are familiar to you. So you can see both those who wrote in these smaller articles, and then other Protestant women for whom there were opportunities to write feature articles, to publish larger manuscripts or novels at the AMP, to translate books, and ultimately to pave the way for long careers as novelists and journalists. It is possible that women were writing for the Mission Press during an earlier period, maybe without signing their names or under other names, maybe under male names. But the earliest feature articles that I could find in An-Nashra included Labiba Barakat's 1883 piece on the priority of the sense of touch, so sort of a scientific piece, and an article by Mariana Maria of Tripoli, published in 1884, entitled The Benefits of History. The following year, Rugina Shukri noted in her first article in An-Nashra that male intellectuals had encouraged the young women of her generation to venture into the field of composition in the service of science and literature. And I think this is really significant, for during that period, it was only the secular periodical al-Muqtataf, which at this time, in fact, was printed at the American Mission Press until 1886 and was founded by Faris Nimr and Yaqub Saraf. Al-Muqtataf was the only other comparable journal in Beirut, or in the region even, that was publishing women's compositions. So these Nahdawi women pioneers in the 1880s paved the way for then a younger generation of Protestants who grew up reading women's writings and articles in An-Nashra and would begin writing themselves for the Mission Press and other Nahda journals later in the 20th century. So I'll mention a few of these earlier generation scholars and then some of the later activists and authors. These included Alice al-Bustani, the daughter of Budrus al-Bustani and Rahel Atta, who I already mentioned. She was an early graduate of American mission schools for girls. Her novel, Sa'iba, published in 1891 at the press of her brother-in-law, Khalil Sarkis, has been acclaimed as one of the first Arab women's novels of the Nahda, and she also wrote for al-Muqtataf, as well as for An-Nashra. Farida Atiyah, who I mentioned before, is also a novelist. She was a graduate and a teacher at the American School for Girls in Tripoli. She was the daughter of a Protestant preacher, Yusuf Atiyah, and she wrote and translated a number of books and articles for the AMP, and later composed articles for other Nahda journals, as well as publishing a novel independently in 1912 and raising 7 children. So she's quite an accomplished individual. Mariam Zaka, who was a graduate and longtime teacher at the American Female Seminary in Sidon, was the woman author who contributed articles to An-Nashra most frequently and over the longest period of time, from the 1880s until 1915, and at that point the press really closed because of the onset of World War I. She also wrote for the first women's magazine in Syria, Al-Hasna, which was founded a bit later. Rugina Shukri, whom I mentioned earlier briefly, composed 3 articles for the Protestant magazine, wrote for Al-Muqtataf, and was a sought-after public speaker. She also had a long career as a Protestant school teacher, including girls' schools in Beirut and Deir al-Qamar. And then Hannah Kasbani Korani, was one of the better-known Protestant women writers who graduated from the Beirut Female Seminary, taught in Tripoli, and became a translator for the AMP and a journalist for a number of Nahda periodicals. She was a frequent lecturer for the Beirut Protestant community and in the US, where she toured for 3 years after she joined the Syrian women's delegation at the women's conferences of the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. Korani unfortunately contracted tuberculosis and died at a young age. She had returned to Lebanon at that point. And for fear of contamination, her family burned all of her manuscripts. So many scholars have assumed that everything that she wrote, except some of the press publications, have been lost. Yet those that she printed at the American Mission Press, like her book on manners and customs, are actually preserved right upstairs in the Near East School of Theology library. So it's a wealth of information about these women. And so that's some of the older generation. Notable authors and activists in the younger generation of Nahdawi Protestant women included Julia Touma, a Damashkiya, the famous women's magazine founder who studied in Sidon with the aforementioned Mariam Zaka. And another was Salma Badr, a Bible woman who immigrated to New York in 1912. Oh, there's Julia Touma, a couple of pictures of her. And this is actually the steamship that Salma rode when she went to New York, and I believe she may be related to some people in the room here. And her one address, published in An-Nashra, may actually be the only thing that she published in her career. This piece, which I consider a sermon, or rather a sermonette because it's quite short, was a distinctly Protestant form of women's publishing in the Nahda. I'll say a little bit more about women's sermonic texts and preaching in a moment. But first, I'd like to take a look at how evangelical women pioneers contributed to the more common themes of the women's Nahda, including education and child rearing. So among the authors who urged women to seek advancement by acquiring academic knowledge and the skills in domestic arts was Ferree Atiyah, who I've mentioned already. Her 1893 novel entitled The Education of Women blended the principles of Protestant faith with the Nahda emphases on intellectual attainment, social progress, modernity, civilized values, and the value of essence over appearance. As such, I'm using this novel to frame my discussions of the writings on education by other women, showing how their work advanced the Nahda while also serving the Protestant community. So I'll spend a bit of time explaining this particular novel. Farida wrote her book in response to the American Syrian Mission's call for women to compose a Christian story on the benefits of educating women, and the novel received a prize from the London-based Religious Tract Society. Now, Farida advanced her argument for women's education in a fictional account of a cultured young man named Adib, who agreed, against his better judgment, to marry a woman named Hannah without meeting her first in person. As one might expect of a fictional commentary on the state of Syrian society during the Nahda, Hannah was not what Adib had hoped for in a bride. Although she was beautiful in appearance and had come from a wealthy family, Hannah's mother followed what Adib characterized as the, quote, outmoded and uncivilized tradition of secluding her daughters at home. Now, this wasn't a commentary on Muslim practices, but rather on the tradition of women's seclusion in Hannah's Christian family. So Farida conveyed that due to her isolation from modern society, Hannah was ignorant, poorly mannered, unwilling to learn anything from her husband, and she became so difficult to live with that it brought Adib to a state of physical collapse. Pressing her point, Farida depicted the illiterate, unwitting Hannah giving her husband a vial of deadly poison, which she had mistaken for his medicine. Now, it was only through the intervention of Adib's educated cousin, female cousin, Saada, who called the doctor, that his life was spared. And she was also the instrument of Hannah's eventual transformation. So after the doctor arrived on the scene just in time to save Adib, Hannah revealed in a monologue the depth of her own ignorance, exclaiming, "How miserable I am, how foolish I am, how wretched. I have earned the result of refusing Adib's useful instruction. I have received the penalty for my wickedness and anger. I nearly murdered Adib with my own hands. I am stupid, ignorant, and lack knowledge." So she's really doing some self-reflection here. She continued to explain the situation. "I had to give him the medicine when Saada was absent, and I didn't know how to read the names of the medication, so I thought this small bottle was the one to give him. Because of my ignorance of reading, I poured it in the cup with the other medicines, and I handed it to him, and he drank. Now this revelation astounded all the listeners in the household. And at that point, all who were present, Ferree Atiyah says, truly appreciated the necessity of educating girls, and they learned how beneficial it was. Now, of course, in this dramatic story, that's exactly what Ferree wanted her readers to affirm as well. This was typical of Nahdawi pieces on women's education. But next came the book's uniquely Protestant emphasis. So some weeks later, Adib emerged from his room, finally cured from the effects of the poison, and was greeted by a visibly changed Hannah, who said meekly to her husband, "From now on, I am determined to live for God and for you, doing what satisfies God and you." She goes on to say, "God has forgiven me because I have been asking for his forgiveness for a month, and I repented to him. I poured my tears out in front of him, and he has accepted, loved, and blessed me as a lost sheep that was found, or as a son who was dead but then came alive again. So please forgive me as God did." Now these touching words rendered Adib speechless. He did not immediately ask what caused this great reversal in her behavior, although the Protestant language of spiritual rebirth probably gave him clues. Only later did Hannah tell him that his cousin Saada had visited her, read the Bible, and prayed with her. And in so doing, Hannah disclosed the nature of her transformation, in effect describing a Protestant conversion. Now, while Hannah's spiritual life and personal mannerisms had been completely transformed, she still remained uneducated. She had become Protestant, she'd become well-behaved, but she was not yet a woman of the Nahda. And so Farida's concluding chapter depicted Hannah studying diligently with her husband. Adib taught her how to read and write, so she soon excelled in Arabic composition like a good Nahdawi author, and could read any subject that interested her. She also became known in the community for her refinement, and her beauty increased, and her face began glowing with knowledge. So in this way, Ferree Atiyah said, God blessed her diligence and crowned it with success. Now the book closed with a dinner party where Hannah, she held the party to mark the year that had passed since what she called her new birth. During the gathering, she stood up and addressed her guests, impressing them with the eloquence of her speech and refined manners, and urging them to spend their resources and efforts to educate their daughters for the sake of their families and for the coming generations. Thus, Hannah performed her Nahdawi Protestant identity in the intimate space of her home. And this final act of the book blurred the public and the private spheres and revealed the author, Ferree Atiyah's view that faith and Nahda values could be fully intertwined. So like Ferree Atiyah, the other women who wrote for the Mission Press periodical on the subject of women's education drew upon their experience as mission school teachers, and they used the Mission Press to expand their teaching to a wider audience. Perhaps they were trying to reach uneducated women like Hannah, or those who had learned to read but didn't have the benefit of a formal education. So I'll give you a couple shorter examples that kind of fit the same mold. One is Maryam Zaka, whose 1886 article in a Nashra entitled Diligence and Perseverance treated the same theme as Farida's novel. It advocated for families to send their girls to school and urged women to work diligently, as Hannah did, for self-improvement. But the article also, however, revealed Zaka's perspective as a real social activist, seeking change in her society by and for women. She extolled the virtues of diligence and perseverance as key for the success of nations and as the means through which Syrian women might elevate themselves to their full potential and, as she said, keep pace with men in the field of science. Now, in response to those Syrians who might claim women had only half a brain, Maryam Zaka asserted that both women and men were created in God's image and possessed equal intellectual capacity. And so, with this religious language, she charged Syrian women with the responsibility of proving their mockers wrong. And she really was trying to make education a religious obligation and not just something that would serve the society in general. So Mariam Zaka, Farida Atiya, and some of the other first-generation Nahdawi authors whose pieces I listed earlier paved the way for a younger generation, as I mentioned, those who would advocate for women's education in the early 20th century. And perhaps the most important of these Protestant women was Julia Toama, later ad-Damashqiya. Some of you may have attended Nova Robinson's fall lecture on Julia, so I'm not going to recount her long career as an author or activist. But I'd like to mention her very briefly to make two important points. The first is that long before she started public speaking and writing for secular Nahda periodicals, which was in the 19-teens, Julia published the first piece of her career in an-Nashra in 1905. At that time, she was a teacher at the Quaker school in Brahmana. So she got her start in an explicitly Protestant periodical. In the piece, entitled "The Relation of the Educated Woman to Her Homeland," used Protestant religious language to urge women to serve al-Watan. For example, using biblical imagery that she had likely heard in sermons at the Evangelical Church of Beirut, she argued, "We waste much of the talents that were given to us, and we suffocate the seeds of true education and religion with the thorns of neglectfulness. Instead of being useful to our homeland and the cornerstones of building the new temple of progress, we become a catastrophe for the country, the home, and the family." With this assessment of the state of women in her country, Julia alluded to the biblical parable about those who stifle the seeds of the gospel. She also recalled the parable of the talents, about the anxious man who buried his money. And while the view of women as the foundation of the nation was common in the Arab women's movement, Julia's reference to the cornerstone and the temple evoked the vision of Jesus Christ as the foundation and the followers as the stones to build the church. And so, like these teachings from the New Testament, Julia's statement signified that a person's life should bear fruit. With such words, she strove to put her beliefs into practice and to promote sociocultural change, uniting Nahdawi values with Protestant religiosity, like many of the pioneers of the women's awakening who had come before her. Now, my second point is that Julia built on this legacy of earlier women writers in an-Nashra, especially her teacher in Sidon, Mariam Zaka. So without these Protestant forerunners, Julia's own legacy might not have been as impressive. We can, in fact, detect the echoes of their work in her own. So Julia addressed her women readers in 1905 in words strikingly reminiscent of Zaka's activist language that I read earlier in 1887, saying, "Put on the necklaces of thought, read the newspapers, adorn yourselves with the jewels of knowledge, and maybe we will reach the goal of serving our beloved country." Now, in Zaka's article, she said, "Let us strip off our robe of indolence, put on the garment of diligence, pick up the pearls of knowledge, and adorn ourselves with the jewelry of literature." So it seems almost like a transfer from teacher to student, or the sort of language that was simply being passed along during the women's Nahda. With that, I'd like to turn now to a second theme in Nahdawi women's writings and lectures, bringing up the Syrian nation, or in other words, raising a child well. So this subject, the first subject of education, is actually very strongly tied to this second theme that Nahdawi women lifted up in their writings, as Syrian Protestant women linked civilizational progress and an educated woman's work in the home in a way that resonated with their faith. And in doing so, they advanced what would become a separate genre of Nahdawi discussions, both in Syria and also in Egypt. And it was known as tarbiyah literature. So there's a lot of this out there, but these are some examples from Protestants who were talking about the proper raising of children. So Regina Shukri, the longtime Protestant school teacher, published two pieces on this subject in an-Nashra in 1885 and 1899. I'm just going to give you two short excerpts to give you an idea of the sort of argument that she and other women were making. Now, although she did briefly recognize the role of the father in parenting, Regina really focused on the mother. She said, "A mother is the one that God," I went too far. I guess I don't have that quote for you. I apologize. She said, "A mother is the one that God has prepared for this work of bringing up the child, and the happiness or misery of the children depends on her. From her, the child takes strength and wisdom, so neglecting the education of girls is one of the most harmful things for humankind." Now, she pressed this point further by refuting the belief that if young women were wealthy and beautiful enough, it would be unnecessary to educate them. This is very similar to Ferree Atiya's novel. So she explained this, saying, "Let us suppose that one of the uneducated girls is so beautiful that everyone who sees her is attracted to her at first. Then when she opens her mouth, she speaks in a harsh and witless way, revealing that she is empty of gentleness and kindness and full of pride. She is so immature and ignorant that if asked about America, she would reply, 'Is America a man or a woman?' And if questioned about Paris, she would say, 'Is this a mountain or a river?' This happens because she is uneducated." She continued, "At the same time, another daughter comes forward who has less beauty than the first. She may be more ugly than pretty, but she smiles respectably, bows her head in shyness, and talks in a low voice, with speech full of gentleness and politeness. She is educated, and if you ask her about something, she will respond with the correct answer. So the first impression you had will therefore change, and another impression will be produced. Thus, education is the real beauty, not the apparent beauty." So this passage conveyed Regina's aim to undermine what she viewed as an outmoded way of evaluating a woman's worth. Drawing on the contrast between appearance and inner essence evoked in Ferree Atiya's novel about the beautiful but ignorant Hannah, Regina Shukri emphasized the distinction between merely beautiful and truly cultivated mothers. Now, a second Syrian Protestant woman to publish tarbiyah literature in a nashra was the novelist Alice al-Bustani. Her text was the address that she gave in April of 1894 at an event that commemorated the establishment of the American Mission Schools for Girls, where her own mother, Rahil, had attended in the 1830s. Now, it was in memory of Rahil, who had only died a few months earlier, that Alice was asked to speak at this important event to a crowd of 900 mission school children and hundreds of adults on the subject of the influence of an educated Christian mother upon her children. Now, Alice did not mention her mother directly in the course of the speech, but I think this statement would surely have brought to mind the death of her mother, this statement that she made, the death of her mother the year earlier, as well as the public legacy of her father, Boutros al-Bustani, as she summed up her own view of the mother and father's separate roles in a family, saying, "The impact of a Christian mother does not die with her death, but lives from one generation to another. After she is gone, her children will rise up and bless her because she was a blessing for them. The mother's influence is greater than the influence of the father, as the children are not always able to see their father as much as they see their mother, due to his absence from the home on account of his work. In this case, she is the mistress and manager of the house and the absolute authority in it. Those under her charge take her as a model for their actions and behaviors." So I'll move on then to our third and final example of Protestant tarbiyah literature. You've noticed the previous women are really looking at different roles for men and women. But I think Hannah Karani's piece on tarbiyah hasana in her book, Manners and Customs, is quite unique, or at least it was a bit more progressive, because she was talking just specifically about parental roles, and she didn't focus completely on the mother. And so she used Proverbs 22:6, saying, "Raise a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it." And then she said that the responsibility God has placed for raising and disciplining children is placed upon the shoulder of the parents. So she continually emphasized how both father and mother have an important role to play. And indeed, I would say throughout her whole book on Manners and Customs, this more universalistic focus on men and women together is very noticeable, because she's not primarily concerned with women's issues, Rather, she felt she had a universal message to share with all Syrians, regardless of gender. And so this particular focus on a more universal message leads me to a final example, the similarly universal focus of the first Syrian Protestant women who took up the traditionally male activity of sermon writing. So this is our third genre then. We've already seen how women like Hannah Karani and Julia Toma wove certain scriptural passages into their Nahda articles on otherwise secular subjects. But I'm going to conclude now with a discussion of what I consider to be printed sermons. It was a uniquely Protestant form of publishing during the Nahda, but often printed right alongside text on modern science or advocacy for the education of girls. And so it demonstrated how educated women of the early Syrian and Lebanese evangelical churches became not just authors or activists. Their desire to serve God and al-Watan also led them to preaching, whether through the printed text or actual spoken word. Now, two women we've already met added sermonic text to their repertoire of Nahda publications. These are Maryam Zaka of Sidon and Ferree Atiyah, the novelist. And I'll just briefly say that Zaka wrote a piece on faithfulness, and she reflected theologically on what faithfulness meant for the lives of her readers. And then, for the sake of time, also briefly, Ferree Atiyah, she wrote a sermon, really a scriptural interpretation of the themes raised in Jeremiah 9:4. Beware of your neighbors and put no trust in any of your kin. For all your kin are supplanters, and every neighbor goes around like a slanderer. So it's a very sort of prophetic piece that she is interpreting for her readers in a nashra. So very interesting, and I find it parallels the sorts of sermons that Protestant men were also publishing in a nashra, although I'm not sure if Farida or Maryam Zaka delivered their pieces. But the final piece that I'm going to end with is a piece on patience, on biblical patience by Salma Badr. And she, in fact, did deliver this sermon to a congregation of young women. So her message, like other sermons, began with selected verses from Scripture. She interpreted Matthew 18:21 through 25, the parable of a servant who asked his master to be patient with him as he repaid his debts, but who denied the same mercy to others. Now, she was only 16 years old when she delivered this message, but she clearly had a calling for ministry because she would later expand her preaching activities as she became a Bible woman for the British Syrian mission. So her starting point was this repeated plea in Matthew 18, be patient with me. And about this she said, let's see. Oh, I don't have the text, I'm sorry about that. This is what she said about patience and the characteristics of the unmerciful servant, whom she said all of us share. She said, we ask God for forgiveness, and for the sake of his beloved Son, he forgives our sins freely. But we ourselves take revenge upon our fellow men and punish him for the least mistake or offense against us. We do not want to be patient with him, even though his sin against us is like a drop of water in the great ocean compared to our many sins against God. Now, Salma Badr not only explained her scriptural passage, but she interpreted its relevance for her listeners' lives. All the while, she remained true to the Reformed tradition with its emphasis on human depravity. I think you can hear that a little bit in the quotation that I read. And then moving beyond individual sin, she warned that the lack of patience in daily interactions could cause grief and division within families and prohibit true service toward the Lord. And then she's continuing to encourage her young congregation of listeners that they need to make an important effort as partners in ministry, and they need to realize that sometimes things don't come immediately when they ask God. So the last thing she says is actually a paraphrase from Matthew 24:13. She says, everyone who is patient will be rewarded and will live happily with joy and pleasure until finally receiving eternal life and the crown of glory. As it is written, those who are patient until the end will be saved. So we find that Syrian Protestant women, although they weren't ordained, they weren't licensed to preach at that time, they found alternative ways to engage in preaching. Salma Badr's sermon demonstrated this, as did the activities that she and other Bible women undertook. And if you're interested in that topic, I can say a bit more about it in the Q&A. So we find with these three common genres, tarbiyah literature or upbringing, educational advocacy pieces, and sermonic texts, that Syrian Protestant women wove together the ethos of the Nahda with their own Protestant faith in order to advance what I would call the Protestant women's Nahda. But it wasn't only for the Protestant community. It influenced readers far beyond. And so I think as such, and because of the very early printing of this work, beginning in the 1880s, we should look at them as some of the pioneers of the women's Nahda. Just as we recognize the Protestant women of Lebanon and Syria as groundbreaking authors and activists of the Nahda then, so too we ought to remember them as preachers who used their written words to build up the evangelical church. Thank you. Do you want this? Or?
Thank you, Dr. Womack, for this lovely lecture. That's adding more pieces to the puzzle we have about women in the 19th century.
Or just writing for women's magazines. The Nashra periodical provides a sort of really interesting test case because I think the majority of readers were male, although they were trying to draw in female readers too. And so any, whether he was Protestant or from some other religious community who read that particular periodical, and I think at one time the circulation was at least 1,000, which was pretty large. I mean, it was moderately large for that time, and they were read orally too, that these women's words would really have reached a large number of men and women together. So I can certainly say that there was an impact. I'd also say with the women preachers and Bible women, I found that at the time, especially in the 1860s, after the conflicts there and the deaths of many Protestant women, or men, the women were stepping in, and I think some of the Protestant churches survived because the women were doing the ministry, and that's kind of something that's maybe hidden in the history, but they had an impact certainly beyond just women and girls and children to the wider population. Thanks for that question.
Thank you for your lecture. I read and teach Arab women writings of Nahda in Egypt, in Cairo.
Yeah.
And when you were mentioning these names, which are most of them new to me, I automatically turned to, for instance, Zainab Fawaz, who collected her journalistic articles on her own and published it in Rasail Zainabiyya.
Yeah.
And also Malak Hifni Nasif, she collected her journalistic articles and published them under al-Nisa'iyya. So we have another discourse in Egypt. It's connected directly to independence of Egypt from British occupation and Islamic reform and Tahrir al-Mar'a. So these three were interconnected.
Yes.
So women, when they wrote on one of them, they were writing on the three of them. So Malak Hifni Nasif was a graduate of the Saniya school, the first public schools in Cairo. Maya Zidi, and these are women of your contemporary period. Maiziri was a graduate of Aintura here school in Lebanon. She spoke French and German and English. She translated also works from German and French into Arabic. I'm only mentioning these women because I want to say what makes them as Protestant women different from women who are writing in Egypt of Nahda.
Okay.
This is one thing, and second, because I'm a graduate of Protestant school in Sinai, Evangelical School for Girls in Sinai, I was also thinking of my own schooling, which is, I wish, we would look into the curriculum of Protestant schools for girls, which were liberating to us as women, being schooled in these. For instance, I will never forget the home economics that we used to take, or even family education, and this was part of it, and sports. So this was liberating for us growing up in Protestant. So this will be another form of studying what makes Protestant women different than other women.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your comments. On the second question, I'll just note that Ellen Fleischman, whom I mentioned in my talk, I know she's written at least one article specifically on home economics in the school in Sidon. So she's done some analysis of the curriculum that might be of interest, but I think that's really important. And then the difference from women in Egypt, so Zainab Fawaz, if I understand her history, actually was born in Syria as well. I'll stop and smile for the camera. Yes, okay, South Lebanon. And she was in conversation with some of these women. So Hannah Qurani wrote for her book. So I think in one sense they were all part of a really religiously diverse movement of women that came together and were members of some of the women's societies. And some of them I think were at the same time very committed to their own religious faith. So Zainab Fawaz, she didn't go to the World's Fair because she didn't want to be in a mixed gender audience. So I think what made Protestant women different, some of the training they got in the Protestant schools and some of their particular theological commitments that were slightly different than the commitments of other women, but I think they had a lot in common and would be interesting to study them, kind of their parallel writings. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Do you think Regina Shukri should be classified under child rearing or under abuse for women?
Yeah.
Because the example you gave fits more the first category than the second category.
Yeah, so I think it really blended. And I sort of wonder, sometimes these early women writers, they had to get their message through in a way that would sort of speak to the context. So if child rearing is an important conversation in the Protestant community or in Ottoman Syria, then let's talk about child rearing, but let's emphasize that we've got to educate the women in order to raise the children. So I think you're right, they're very sort of almost one and the same.
And my second question is, in the Tarbiyah genre, did you pass over material about the love of al-Watan?
Oh, yeah, I did actually.
The second part, what was the al-Watan at that time?
Okay.
What was al-Watan, and did women participate in the tarbiyah?
Yeah. So.
And call for the love of al-Watan.
Yeah. So the Hub al-Watan, Boutros al-Bustani's sort of phrase, I didn't see that particularly, the love part. But some of the things I did pass over in the interest of time was the focus on women sort of being the foundation of the nation. So for the success of al-Watan, the woman has to raise the children well, or she has to be well educated, kind of for the future of the society. So it's more about the practicality than actually the love, which is very interesting. I think Julia Tolma's piece was maybe the one that talks the most about it. So the relation of the educated woman to serving the homeland. But what was it? It wasn't a political entity, it wasn't a modern nation state, but I think it was the idea of a modern homeland where Protestants could live with other members in Syria and could advance these ideals of the Nahda, education and and modern science. I didn't see so much of the political in these women's writings. They're really talking about kind of the connection between education and the home, and then the children that they send out into the society, and how that will uplift al-Watan, if that helps.
When you listed the woman authors, Zainab was almost 40 years earlier than all of them. So she was really before them. And her writings, from a feminist point of view, were much more radical.
Yes, I would agree.
So probably, being religious puts a limit on how feminist you can be, And I've experienced this in the two schools I went to. I was at ASG, and at another school here, which was Aliyah, which was, it bred a lot of pioneer women. And I found that at ASG we were held back. It wasn't, at Aliyah we were given much more room to grow and to express ourselves.
Okay.
So and I'd like to ask you a question.
Okay.
I've heard that ASG was the first girls' school in the area. Is that true?
Yeah, so here in
At
Beirut.
the same time in Saudi and Tripoli, or in Beirut?
So the first in Beirut was the 1830s, maybe 1835. So 1835 is the first, like the foundation of the first official school. I think there were some schools and missionary homes before then. And so ASG and actually LAU traces its history back to that, the very first. The Sidon and Tripoli schools were a little bit later because the missionaries came to Beirut first. But thank you for your comment. I agree. Zainab Fawaz seems like really a radical feminist for her day, certainly. And the Protestant women, I think they limited themselves. I wonder what conversations they had internally. But for example, Hannah Karani had this press debate in a number of Egyptian and Syrian papers with Zainab Fawaz over whether women could be politicians, and in all the fields of men, Zainab said yes and Hannah said no. And I think, so when she came to the US, she talked about this. I think she held herself back because the sort of the American perspective on women was, don't go into politics, and the Protestant perspective here was, there's a certain place for women. And then, interestingly, she became in contact with women suffragists like Susan B. Anthony in the United States, and she started shifting her view, or she started saying something different in the United States. So I think you're right that you're speaking to a particular audience, and you can't push too much. You have to speak to that context. Thank you.
My question is, I'm sure Protestant values brought up a lot of things that availed the woman to grow, to better present. So did the press, the Protestant press, that you pointed out, so as a publishing tool. But I wonder how many of these ladies were second generation or third generation Protestants.
Yeah, so
some of them brought their values that are al-Watan ingrained, or maybe even God ingrained, but they were better presented with gender rights or with equal rights, and a Protestant missionary, and a community that was able to maybe address some of their topics that you pointed out. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yes, so I don't know the family histories of all, but I think everyone that I do know was a second generation. So their parents had joined the Protestant church and they were born into the Protestant church. So Julia Toma, Salma Badr, I think she was second, if not third generation. Farida Atiya, her father was the pastor who had converted. So I think you're right. They weren't sort of brand new to the Protestant community. They had grown up in it and, learned some of these things from their parents as well as their teachers.
So I actually have two questions. One, just an elaboration. You mentioned in the 1880s, the American Mission Press started to elicit writings from Protestant women.
Yes.
What was it in the 1880s all of a sudden that compelled
Mhm.
the missionary press to do that?
Yeah, so in 1880, Ibrahim al-Hurani, who's one of the first men that I showed you earlier, maybe I can find his, he became the chief copy editor of the Mission Press. Let's see, where it is. He's far back there. Where is he? There he is. So it had previously been, although Syrians and Lebanese had been involved, it had previously, I think, been in the hands of missionaries. And so I don't know what specifically led him to do so, but some of the women actually say that the men are now inviting them to print things in the press. And so I think that he solicited articles from women in the Protestant community. So I'd say he was one of the advocates for women writers, although I haven't in his work seen him sort of advocating for that. He was, I think, sort of in control of what some of the Syrians were writing. And then also al-Muqtataf, the journal of Faris Nimr and Yaqub Saraf, had started doing this at the same time. So I'm not sure if it was just a Protestant conversation because they were both part of the Beirut Protestant Church, or if they started doing it and then An-Nashr wanted to follow up. But in any case, you have these two journals that give opportunities, but it's this one that has the opportunities for more kind of religious expression for the women.
Thank you. The same question actually goes back to the beginning where you mentioned that we've kind of neglected the spiritual aspect of the Nahda, or the spiritual aspect of the primary characters within the Nahda. How does then that play into our interpretation of the Watan, which was brought up? Because the Watan is supposed to be this sort of secular identity, and if we're going to highlight or start unpacking the spiritual motivations to all these individuals, that actually puts the entire liberal movement behind the Watan into question.
Yeah, thank you. That's really insightful. It hasn't been something I've looked at really deeply, but I think you're right that there might be something there. So just looking at Middle Eastern studies in general, I'd say people aren't talking about the Nahda as being a religious movement. It's secular, or al-Watan is secular. But yeah, I think that there's more work there to be done than on how that term, the love of homeland, could be attached to a spirituality or religiosity. Something that I would have to look into a little bit deeper, but I think that's very perceptive and important. Thank you.
I think we have still time for one last question.
Thank you. Professor, I find your presentation concerning the role of women very interesting, especially that the time frame that these women made their contribution was not favorable for this work.
Yeah.
But today we see very few Protestant women doing even closely to what these women have done, in spite of the fact that there's more freedom and there's more ease of communicating with people. Could it be that today the Protestant community have taken up the same attitude as the Greek Orthodox Church has already been taking, which means they are happy with what they have and there's no need for improvement, or there's no need for contributing anything to the society? Thank you.
Well, I'm not sure I can say yes or no to that, but I mean, I think in every society we find that there are barriers that women need to surmount, and also really huge advances that communities are able to make. When I lived in Lebanon, I saw some. Since then, I've been delighted at the ordination of a number of the women that are in this room. And really, it's interesting because somebody asked me to write about Middle Eastern women, and I wrote about Protestants, and I said, there was one woman that you wrote an article on who had been... Yeah, Juradini, who had been ordained in the 1920s. And I said, to date, she's the only one. And then the next month, Arola was ordained. And then, a few months later, it was Najla. And I had to go back and change the publication because, so I think that history is in the making right here. And there's certainly more conversation, but I can't insert myself into that. So thank you all for being here and for your questions. I've appreciated it.
Thank you very much. We can continue the conversation over coffee outside.
Thank you. Oh, thank you so much. I appreciated the questions.